plus years in many different roles, and I'll give you some perspective on this and a bit of controversy and a hot take on what it is to do when we talk about controls. But before I dive into that, how many of you have actually worked with implementing security controls? Yeah, good, okay, yeah. So when we talk about implementing security controls, there's always the statement of it has to be compliant. Have you used that one before? When people ask, why are we doing this? Compliance. We have to be compliant. Yeah? Be honest. You've heard it, you've done it. And said it. Now, here's the thing. How many of you own cars? Almost all of you, great. In Denmark, we have a law, the færdselsloven, traffic law, Article 67. You all know about that one, Danes with cars, right? So, Article 67 says that before you traverse onto a main road that is within the boundaries of the traffic law, you have to check the car. Tail lights, headlights, fog lights. Yeah? How many does that when you traverse that? Worry not, worry not. So I'm your CSO, your car security officer. You're the CEO of that car. I will be in your face every day whenever you leave the driveway. Have you checked your headlights? Have you checked your taillights? Have you checked your fog lights? Have you checked under the car for playing kids? Have you checked the tailpipe for bananas? Have you checked for vandalism in the area that could potentially ruin your taillights before you go into the road? You would fire me in less than 3 days if I did that every single day in your faces. So compliance here, you can see, doesn't really bring much value, but is by law. Now, another thing is, every 2 years, you bring your car to certification, right? Yeah. Why? You lose your car. You lose the ability to use your vehicle if you don't get it certified. Now, you don't do it because it's compliance. You do it because you have something to lose. And that's the difference between doing things for compliance or doing something because you lose something. That's the motivation you're looking for when you're implementing control frameworks. What's the motivation? What's the goal? You can see it yourself. If I hit you every day, check your car, you're fired. I can't use my car. Holy crap, let's check it. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. And I also have a confession. We're going to talk a little bit less about controls and a little bit more about risk management. So we're going to barricade the doors. I lied to you. I said controls because that's just to get you in here to listen. But the thing is, controls comes on the background of a good risk model. If you don't do risk management, don't care about control frameworks. So that is the important piece, and that's what I'm going to talk about here today. Control frameworks versus compliance. So we talked about this in terms of purpose. Because we have to be compliant. Yeah? You've heard it, you've seen it, you hate it, I hate it. When we talk about the scope of it, this is what happens. Right? Whenever you ask, so, we need to be compliant, we need to implement identity and access management. What is the scope? Entire enterprise. Holy shit, how are we going to do that? What are the consequences? When you ask IT professionals, what are the consequences if we do not do this? We go bankrupt. True story. I've been sitting in a lot of risk committees, and this is what I hear. Show me a company that has gone bankrupt due to not having identity and access management controls. Just name one. So these are the things that we are battling as security professionals when we are talking to top management of how do we want to implement our controls. We take the maximum risk exposure, we take the entire scope, and we say, because it has to be compliant. So, to inspire a little bit different thinking, how about we tie it to a business goal? So if 40% of our revenue is generated during Christmas time, we do a technical translation. Well, that basically means that some of our controls must align towards 99% availability of our ERP, POS, web front-end in November, December, and January. I promise you, business will start to listen instead of everything all the time. Where do I apply it? How about we do it on the order to business or order to cash, that process. This is where the cash flow comes in. All the systems that has to do with payment, those are critical during November, December, January. Full enterprise asset versus affected and supporting infrastructure asset inventory. What is easiest? Probably just doing segmentation and looking into what is actually supporting the business and not the entire scope. You heard of this earlier when investors was talking in terms of, are you doing the full asset? We always start with a full asset list. Show me a company that has full control of their assets, every single asset. It's difficult. It's a multi-year project. You will never get it off the ground, ever. Maybe not ever, but it's very difficult. Access and authorization controls on enterprise level versus affecting and supporting infrastructure. Again, comes down to scope, make it edible, make it presentable, and also getting the support of the business. If you're doing enterprise level, the ones out in sales they don't give a, pardon my language, they don't give a crap. But if you tell them your point of sales, they won't work if we don't do this. That's a different story. You will get their attention. Probably also get some budget. Consequences. When we're talking about consequence, it's also important to be precise, as you can be. So if we talk about maximum exposure all the time, it's just like playing the violin. It's a phrase. So if I say we're going to go bankrupt or we're going to lose, 80% of our yearly revenue, blah, blah, et cetera, but actually it's only 40% of our revenue that we're going to lose, not 100%. And we're not going to go bankrupt. The more truthful this information is when we're serving at the top management level, the more they take it seriously. The more you cry about it and saying, everything's going to break, everything's going down, hell is loose. Your credibility drops very fast. So, when we talk about implementing security controls, there's also a question of who. Who is the end customer of the control? Normally, the organization I've worked with, it's always security gets the end of the stick. You own the security controls. You implement the security controls. If something breaks, it's your fault. Well, the thing is, let's say we don't implement it. It's actually the sales division that's losing revenue. It's not the security team. So why is it the security owns the risk? Because they're not the one who's losing the operational revenue on this. So it is also a training in terms of getting the right owners to a control. Because if you're trying to do it all by yourself, you're never going to get it done. You need support of the business, and you need them also to take ownership. The only way to do that is also to get them to see, learn, and also feel the pain, so to speak, that if we don't do this, it is your revenue that's going to get hit. And again, coming back to what are the consequences. If you go to the business and say, if you don't implement identity and access management, well, your entire business is going to go to crap. Doesn't work. Again, credibility. If you can talk about the availability of systems, saying that, okay, it might be 80 or 90% down, you'll lose certain things, and you have a range, you again get that credibility because now you're actually talking truthfully. So always think about partial impact rather than full impact, because full impact, yes, it's a possibility, but it's a low possibility. Typically, when something happens, it's partial impact. How do you do it? In terms of controls, it's not just technical. It's also about people, it's about training them, understanding what is it they need to do. Is it documented? Can you automate it? So as I said, it's going to be less about controls and a little bit more about risk management, because that is really the driving point for controls, why we do controls, how we implement, how we tell the business that they need to take this seriously. So why do we do risk management? It's because I've seen a lot of risk assessments where we're comparing qualitative, quantitative measures. Somebody say this is a high risk. Others say this is going to cost us $20 million. How do I know of those two which is most important? So if IT comes and say, this is a high risk because we don't have access to our systems, the salespeople comes and say, if I don't get this sale home, I'm going to lose $5 million. How does top management measure, or how do they make a decision based on that? So the scenarios is also important because it has to be comparable. If I talk about system down and sales talk about sales pipeline, again, I have no comparisons of what is what. So that really doesn't give me any value of importance when I'm trying to measuring and making decisions on what to do. So how do we do this? We need a common taxonomy model. I'll get into that a little bit later. We need a common impact evaluation. What do we measure on? Is it dollars? Is it text, contextual, so it's qualitative? It has to be comparable. So the data that comes in risk management has to be comparable. I'll talk a little bit about it later. Coming back to the impact, we've addressed it. Is it dollars? Is it downtime? Is it brand damage? This has to be the same across the board. If you're talking about network is down and marketing is talking about sales pipeline and revenue increase, it's not comparable again. So it has to be comparable. The impact of the business has to be comparable. So we're talking about the methodology of doing this aligned. When we talk about risk definition, there is a story here to be told in terms of when I was doing this with my team back in a company I can't mention, where we were talking about the goal. So I hear a lot about cyber risks today. It's kind of a buzzword. Now, I'm going to be a little bit provocative and say there is no such thing as cyber risk. And I'm going to get into why that is. So if my goal, this is just an example, my goal is to get to work every single day to be there on time, right? On time. I need to be at work on time. If my tire blows on my car, is that a risk? And this is a trick question. It's not. And that's what IT does. There's a risk that the interface is down. There's a risk of malware. There's a risk that I'm getting hacked. But that's not the goal, right? The goal is driving the business. The goal is uptime. It is an event that has a cause towards my goal. So the risk actually is, if this happens, I'm late at work. That's the risk. But the event is the tire blows out. Now it's comparable to sales. Sales don't talk about minor details into what is the problem that they don't reach their target. They're saying, we don't reach our target, this is what we lose. Same thing goes for IT. If this doesn't work, this is what we lose. So we don't care about the risk of getting hacked, the risk of malware, the risk of, you can continue. That's an event. That event belongs in security. We talk about the events inside of security. The outcome, that's the risk. The outcome is downtime. The outcome is that the system is unavailable to drive the sales, the point of sales, credit card transactions, whatever, that generates the revenue. It's a mindset change. So therefore, talking about cyber risk, it's actually an operational risk. The operational risk is the operations of a given company. And that's really where this comes in. Residual risk, inherent risk. Inherent risk, you have no controls. This is the maximum that's going to happen. Residual, that's when you implement your controls. And this could be your CIS, critical security controls, that mitigates that. And then there's the categorization. And that's really where my provocative statement is, there is no such thing as cyber risk. It's a buzz in the industry. It makes people think, oh, cyber, great, I need to talk about this. I need to learn about this. It's actually what we call a non-financial risk. It's a risk to the operations of a company. If you're hit by cyber, typically you lose availability. That's an operational risk. Just like supply chain. If something doesn't come to harbor and I can't sell my wares, it's an operational risk. All of a sudden, now you can compare cyber risk with traditional risk, what they do in sales, what they do in supply chain, what they do in marketing, and so forth and so forth. Now it's comparable. Very important, comparable. So this is, again, a true story. I was sitting in a risk committee, and this is what we got served in terms of, give us your top 10 risk. IT, we have no overview of our IT landscape. Sound familiar? Yeah. Supply chain, goods are stuck at a harbor. We have penalty incurred on daily basis. We have operating cost effect for prolonged transportation, blah, blah, blah. New sales impacted due to out-of-stock item. Marketing, we had a missed launch in our campaign. The sales pipeline is going to degenerate by this amount of percentage. We're going to expect a conversion rate of this percentage. So basically, new revenue was the risk. Existing revenue was the risk. And IT, we have a P1 finding. What do you think the risk committee said? Let's focus on the money and where the money is where it hurts. Because we don't know what this means. And this is some of the issues we see in the industry is we work with audit, we work with compliance. We do not put a dollar tag on what is actually the output or the outcome if something happens. This is just to give you a list of how it looks like when we try to compare things. We're comparing new sales, out-of-stock items, and non-compliance. On the quantitative side, we were comparing future revenue, current revenue, and P1 findings. I can tell you one thing is the last one, nobody cared about it. Coming back to risk modeling. So what do we actually do? How do we do this? The first thing is getting the definition correct. What are we actually measuring? The controls that we have, SIS 18, previous SANS, but now taken over by our Center of Internet Security. We could use those controls and those frameworks because those are the ones that affect the likelihood. The more controls we have, the less likelihood that a risk occurs. We also need the calculation method. Is it historical occurrences that we use? Is it ranges? Is it Monte Carlo simulations? What? But the thing is, once that is defined, every department has to use it because then you have similar data giving you the same comparison in terms of how do we actually define the likelihood? The likelihood of a ship not coming to harbor versus the likelihood of an IT system down, measured in the same way, through simulations or historical occurrences to give you that basis and that data. So it's no longer guesswork. It's no longer, I think it's medium, just because. Or it's low because that's what my gut tells me, or that's what the experts tell me. My architects tell me that this is a low risk. Based on what? Impacts. What is it that it actually impacts? Again, coming back to dollars, business processes, or things that actually affects the operations of a company. Operational cost, revenue loss, number of affected employees or customers, amount of downtime. If this is what you select, it has to be the same throughout all organizations. So sales, do they measure on amount of downtime? Not really. Number of affected employees, customers, probably. But once it's agreed, it's comparable. I think you get where I'm coming from. It has to be comparable, otherwise you cannot have that discussion at top layer where they're making these decisions. So I want to choose something called the bow tie model. I don't know, has anyone worked with bow tie model before? Yes. So the bow tie model really comes back to the ultimate goal. What is the goal? Let's say it's Christmas sales. 40% of the revenue is generated in Christmas, November, December, January, so let's put that as the company goal. So it's not uptime of systems, it's not full asset inventory, it's not within an IT goal. This is a company goal that we're working on, and that's the Christmas sales. We map out the risk events. So again, coming back to the example, my tire blows out, or my windshield is broken, or something. That's what happens over here. What happens to IT, or the digital platform that we're operating on? That could be disruption, it could be information theft, it could be living off the land type of attacks, and it could be by state-sponsored companies, or it could be hacktivists, drive-by, blah, blah, and so forth and so on. So you need to have actor, event, and that's actually what's going to hit your company in terms of an attack, let's say. What's the impact? And here it is important that you map out, is it no impact if we get hit? Is it partial loss? Is it full loss? Is it brand damage? Is it whichever? But again, it has to be comparable to the other departments. So if they're reporting on revenue, then that one has to be revenue. Or if they're reporting on number of customers that's affected, then that's where that goes. And then comes the bow tie. Preventive controls and reactive controls. And this is where your framework comes to work. This is when you're ready to take a framework and start working with it. Because a framework is a catalog of items for you and for inspirational purposes. So the whole point, in terms of, if I put compliance in the middle of that, it ruins the whole picture of what it is I want to achieve. So therefore, when we're working with frameworks, always be wary of what is the risk event, what is the impact, and then we have the controls that mitigate this. So either it's preventive or it's reactive. Let's go into the framework itself. The good thing about CIS, critical security controls, is that they use the same taxonomy as NIST when we're talking about categorization. So we have identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. If we take that and we map it out on the the bow tie, it looks a little bit something like this. So you already have a way of distributing your controls in terms of if it's a preventive or reactive controls in the bow tie model. This is basically the catalog itself of the 18 controls. Now, underneath those controls, there are a lot of sub-controls as well. The thing I like about the critical security controls is that they've actually made it easier, not easy, but easier to use, because they've actually put it into implementation groups, which some of the other frameworks haven't done. So what does that mean? Implementation group 1 is for relatively smaller, medium businesses, less mature companies. It's what we would call getting the foundations right. It's a matter of sub-controls underneath each of those controls of the 18 controls. If you look at number 2, it's a little bit larger, more mature company. You have probably a security specialist, not necessarily a security organization. You know a little bit more about cybersecurity and infrastructure security, and so forth and so forth. 3, enterprise level, the golden standard. You have enterprise risk management, you have a cybersecurity division, you have ITSM, you have the works, right? So this gives companies at least an ambition of where do I target. I see some companies, actually a lot of companies, that aim for IG3 from off the bat. We want everything. I want to be ISO certified. I need to take all the controls. Or I'll take the NIST. I have to certify against NIST. I need every control. Probably not if you are a small, medium business, or if you're not mature. This is how it looks like in distribution when we're talking about IG1 or implementation group 1. You don't have a lot of controls in, for example, penetration testing. That's what a lot of companies like to do, is penetration testing. Why do penetration testing on something you know that is already open as a window? So get your assets in control, look into your data protection, secure configuration. Again, this is inspiration of where to start, and this is really where it can help less mature companies of figuring out what control sets should I use to lower the likelihood of being attacked, and in the end, affecting my downtime. Now, I did say something in regards to, well, I'm going to go to 2. You can just see they're expanding. Not going into more detail around that. And then you have the full stack when you hit implementation group 3. What I did say before is that when you're applying it, you still need to think. So if it's the Christmas sales, you will probably not do the entire enterprise inventory. You would do the inventory that affects the Christmas sales. You have multiple systems. It could be your payment systems. It could be your customer front end. It could be your point of sales. It could be your ERP system. But at least now you have a place to start. You know what it is we're talking about in terms of sales. You can then drill down what are the supporting applications, platforms, and infrastructure. Now, the smart architect would say, yeah, but everything is interconnected. True, it is, but it's a start. And if you're going to do the interconnect, well, then everything is interconnected because everything is on the internet anyways. You're going to risk assess the entire internet? Probably not. It's a start. Remember that. It's a start. It gives you a scope. It gives you a place to start working. The less the scope, the easier it is for you to start implementing rather than spending, we call it analysis paralysis. You start analyzing every single thing because everything is interconnected. You never stop analyzing. You need to get this off the ground, find the most critical systems, start analyzing that, and start closing the holes. Do it fast. Ambition level. Spend versus loss. So you can't keep implementing security controls all the time. There is a natural stop in terms of budget. You cannot secure against every single thing. It's just not possible. What is the ambition level? What are you aiming for? Which threat actors do you want to protect against? Drive-bys or state-sponsored? What industry are you in? What do you think is most likely to hit you? And you could also say, you know what, if a state sponsor attacks us, we'll just lay down flat because we cannot protect against that. It's fair enough. You made a decision, or at least leadership made a decision on that. Impact. When we talk about impact, it's not just about immediate impact. It's about impact over time. When you get hit first, it's going to cost you something. If you don't do anything about it, it's going to cost you more as time goes. And that appetite has to be defined. How much money is leadership willing to lose if you get hit? That is also important. You can't say 0 because there's no such thing. Once you get hit, it's going to cost you. Whether it's sales, I mean, they get hit. Maybe not from a cyber attack, but their pipeline, they only get, 50% conversion rate maybe. They had a bad year in their Christmas sales. So there will always be a loss somewhere. So having a 0 appetite, it's not real. So what is that pain point for leadership? Because that gives you, again, how much budget should we use if that's the loss that we expect? And you saw this at Vesta's presentation. There is a bar or a graph where there is a sweet spot in terms of investment versus the level of likelihood we're attacking or mitigating, and then go use that as your goal. This is how much budget we have. These are the controls we should have in terms of investment. Another way of doing this is actually using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This gives you the vector. So once you know your systems, your critical systems that supports your business flow, and you run an attack against that, you'll also figure out which tactics and procedures are most likely to be used, and that's where you put your controls. Because you're not going to cover everything. Cover the ones that you believe, when you're doing an actual attack against your infrastructure, the ones that is the most likely path into your systems. And then select those controls and focus on those controls. So coming back to the bow tie, I've mapped, as you can see, the implementation groups on each side, whether it's a reactive control or it's a preventive control. Again, it should be selected on the basis of what is the attack path into our infrastructure. One of them is I put in a G1.1 enterprise asset inventory, but what I do mean is the asset that affects the Christmas sales. The same with the access to asset. It's the assets that has something to do with the Christmas sales. That's how you start working with it, and then do your MITRE attack, identify the procedures, what can you actually do to close those gaps. And then I can recommend using the CIS 18 controls as your framework. Again, the framework is a tool for you to use. It's not a compliance tool. It's not that I have to satisfy every single control. Use it as what it was designed for, a tool to help you lower the likelihood through preventive controls and reactive controls. And that's what I had to say today. Any questions? Yes?
How would you fit the growing attack surface that is coming up with all the development in software and open source and all that into the risk?
So that's where you, yeah, it's a good question.
MITRE is a perspective of attack.
Yes.
But the surface is more about the defense.
Yeah. So it's two sides of a coin, right? The MITRE is an attack, but the MITRE is also where you would identify the vulnerabilities, and that could potentially be backdoors or poorly written code or software development that you're introducing. But if you go back, if you are using customized code, that's part of your asset inventory. So let's say you purchased from a small company that develops something customized for you. It could be a teller machine. The teller machine would be an application somewhere in this piece. When you do a MITRE attack, you of course need to attack every single service you find in terms of that infrastructure that you've identified. And through that, you should be able to find it if you're thorough enough on your attack. Yes, okay, so I need to go through full type. I think I get your point. So, and I'm gonna actually refer back to when you saw Vestas, what they did. So when you're working with, let's say this MITRE framework here, for every single piece that you identify as valid in your attack vector into the infrastructure, I'm gonna go further back here, is you do simulations, basically. You simulate the attack. Where did I do that? I had a likelihood here somewhere. I think it was, anyhow, Monte Carlo simulations, basically. If you know what Monte Carlo simulation is? You define a cycle of X number. It could be 10,000, 100,000, 200, 1 million. Those are the iterations. You put in the values. If you know that, let's say vulnerability, this is an attack component of a vulnerability. I'm gonna test this out 1 million times. It'll give you a probability out of 1 million. What is the probability this is actually gonna happen? So it could be 50%, it could be 40%, but your Monte Carlo simulation will give you that number when you do that simulation. If you do that throughout the entire vector, you can then start working all the percentages and then give you a probability. That's how you define the likelihood. Yeah? We can talk about it a little bit later. I can explain it more in detail. Yeah. Yes?
Regarding, don't go too deep in this, when you start this is 18. We typically look at risk as like a function. This function is down, but this function, or behind this function there is an application, and behind that application there's a server, and behind that server there's a service. So how deep do you go?
That's your MITRE attack framework that helps you define that. So one of the things that is good in the MITRE attack framework is one of those is lateral movement. So you might actually move out of scope. So let's say that you have this here, this fancy, let me see if I can find it again. I think there. You might not have identified a system that's actually affected by an attack vector. So if you use your MITRE and you're actively attacking your own systems, you might actually find backdoors that you figure out is actually dependent on that, and then you put that in. But again, it's really about also know when to stop, because if you don't stop, you will never be done.
Yeah, because we of course we have the ERP system, and that was identified as the critical thing. But when we then started looking into it, everything was dependent on AD. So
Then that figure, yeah,
to be the first because
exactly. But then that changes your risk perspective because you did the attack. So when you're following that, you might figure out you need to reevaluate your critical systems. And that's the validation layer, is that you attack what you think is your critical, and then you attack it, and then you figure out AD is actually a little bit more critical than the ERP system. And then it goes up there. Yes?
Putting on your CISO hat, how do you explain this to the board?
That's a whole different slide.
I know. Is it even possible?
It is, but that's a different presentation for a different time. But it is possible. It is possible. And it doesn't look like this at all. It comes down to numbers, and it comes down to the correct context. So I don't know if I have a good, I actually don't have a good example. I can talk about a little bit about experience where I was sitting in, where we were comparing IT towards supply chain. It's one of my favorites, because the supply chain are typically very precise in their predictions of what this is going to cost us if we don't get a certain element from A to Z. And also, what does it cost if it lays in harbor for an extra day, or if there's storm. They do this for a living. So, and therefore, we had to match it up in terms of the way they communicated and say, well, okay, this company that we're working with here, we do financial transactions. So that is the key element. That's the goal of the company. So everything I talk about in terms of risk has to map back to financial transactions. So that's where I start. This is the financial transaction. I can't give a number, but let's say it's 20 million. We do $20 million of transactions on a daily basis. This is the credit card system. If that is down just 2 hours, we lose around $4 million an hour or whatever. So you start talking those terminologies, because when you double click on that transaction system, you figure it out, okay, that's the mainframe, it's the network switch, it's the crypto device, and then you can do your fan out. But that you don't present. That is for a different team. Yeah? Any further questions? No? All right. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. So hopefully I'm not going to hear we do it because of a compliance. I'll slap you. All right. Oh, yes. No. They need a congregated view, aggregated view. Yes. You aggregate, you talk about the impact, the loss, and also the mitigation of amount of controls we have, the amount of cost for those controls. That's it. Everything underneath goes to architect teams. Yeah.
So
All right.
in this
Thank
case,
you.
Thank you, Jan.